June 4th, 1942. 0645 hours, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo settled into his Zero's cockpit with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost. Through the crystalline morning air, he could see the ungainly silhouettes of American fighters climbing to meet Kido Butai's strike force. He actually laughed. The Americans were sending up F4F Wildcats. Those fat, stubby little aircraft the Imperial Japanese Navy pilots had nicknamed the American Chicken. Shindo had shot down 6 Chinese fighters over Nanking, 4 more over Canton. He had flown combat air patrol during the Pearl Harbor strike. His squadron had destroyed 9 British Hurricanes over Ceylon without a single loss. Now he would add American scalps to his collection. "Look at them waddle," his wingman transmitted. "Like ducks trying to climb." What Shindo didn't know, what none of the 54 Zero pilots approaching Midway that morning could have known, was that within 8 months, his vaunted aircraft would go from hunters to hunted. The kill ratio would flip so dramatically that by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, American pilots flying that same chicken would be shooting down nearly 7 Japanese fighters for every one they lost. Shindo dove toward the climbing Wildcats with the absolute certainty of a man whose aircraft had never been beaten in single combat. His Zero Model 21 represented everything Japanese aeronautical engineering had achieved. At 15,000 feet, no aircraft in the world could match its maneuverability. The Type 96 Claude fighters the Zero had replaced could barely break 200 miles per hour. His Zero could reach 330. It could climb at 4,000 feet per minute. Its controls were so light and responsive that a pilot could throw the aircraft into impossible aerobatic maneuvers with barely a touch. More importantly, every pilot in his squadron had at least 800 flight hours, most over 1,000. They had trained in air-to-air combat since their first day at flight school. The Americans, intelligence suggested, were lucky if their pilots had 300 hours, most of that in trainers. They were farmers and shopkeepers, pressed into uniform, given wings, and sent to die. The previous December, over the Philippines, Zeros had shot down 18 American P-40 Warhawks in a single engagement without loss. At Darwin, Australia, they had destroyed 8 of 10 defending fighters. Over Rangoon, Japanese pilots claimed 23 British and American aircraft destroyed for 6, Zeros damaged, none lost. The mathematics of aerial superiority had become a simple equation. Zero encounters enemy, enemy dies. Shindo's squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Masao Sato, had studied reports from China extensively. The Wildcat, according to captured documents, was 40 pounds heavier than the Zero per horsepower. Its wing loading was higher, meaning tighter turns belonged to the Zero. The American fighter topped out at 318 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. The Zero could reach 331 at 16,000 feet. Below 20,000 feet, any competent Zero pilot could simply choose when to engage and when to disengage. But these numbers told only part of the story. The Zero's combat debut over Chungking on September 13th, 1940 had stunned everyone. 13 Zeros escorted bombers deep into Chinese airspace. 27 Chinese-American volunteer group fighters intercepted them. The result: all 27 Chinese fighters shot down or destroyed on the ground for 0 Japanese losses. Chinese pilots reported that the new Japanese fighters could turn inside a falling leaf. That performance was no accident. Mitsubishi and Nakajima engineers had spent 3 years perfecting the design. Sumitomo Metal Industries had developed extra super duralumin, an alloy stronger and lighter than anything America or Britain could produce. Every component was weight optimized. The fuselage skin measured just 0.8 millimeters thick in places. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no pilot protection. None of it was needed, because the Zero simply didn't get hit. Japanese pilot doctrine reinforced this philosophy. Fighting spirit, aerobatic skill, and aggressive tactics would overwhelm any opponent. Gunnery was important, but marksmanship mattered less than positioning. Get on the enemy's tail, stay there through superior maneuverability, then fire at leisure. The 20mm cannon might carry only 60 rounds per gun, giving just 8 seconds of firing time. But 8 seconds was an eternity when you owned the sky. Shindo checked his formation. His wingman held position perfectly off his right wing. The second element flew 2,000 feet higher, ready to pounce on any American who tried to climb away. This was the three-plane Shotai, the fighting unit that had dominated every air battle from China to Ceylon. The lead pilot was the sword, the wingmen the shield. They had trained this formation until it was instinctive, until 3 aircraft moved as one organism. The American formation looked pathetic by comparison. Someone had told them to fly in defensive circles, each covering the other's tail. Defensive flying. The very concept disgusted Shindo. Warriors attacked. Only cowards flew defensively. This would be easier than the British over Ceylon, easier than the Australians at Darwin. He selected his target, a Wildcat struggling to gain altitude, its radial engine bellowing smoke. The pilot was probably panicking already, knowing what was about to happen. Shindo armed his weapons. 2 Type 99 20mm cannon, 2 Type 97 7.7mm machine guns. The cannon shells would rip through that Wildcat's thin aluminum-like paper. He had done it before. He would do it again. The morning sun glinted off the American fighter's stubby wings as Shindo began his attack run. Within hours, he would learn his first lesson about the Wildcat. Within weeks, that lesson would become a survival manual. Within months, it would become a death sentence. The Grumman Iron Works had begun designing the Wildcat in 1936, responding to a United States Navy requirement for a new carrier-based fighter. The original prototype, designated F4F-2, had been conceived as a biplane before common sense prevailed. Early versions struggled with engine problems. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 power plant proved unreliable. The United States Navy initially rejected the design, choosing instead the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. But Leroy Grumman and his engineering team refused to abandon the project. They knew something the Navy procurement officers didn't, something the Japanese would learn the hard way. You didn't need the fastest aircraft. You didn't need the most maneuverable aircraft. You needed an aircraft that brought its pilot home. The engineering philosophy that guided Wildcat development stood in stark contrast to Japanese design principles, where Mitsubishi engineers obsessed over weight reduction, measuring airframe components in grams. Grumman's team built for survival. The main landing gear struts were so robust that test pilots deliberately bounced landings at excessive speeds, trying to break them. They couldn't. The wing spars were over-engineered by a factor of 2, capable of withstanding G-loads far beyond what combat maneuvering would ever generate. Leroy Grumman himself demonstrated the folding wing mechanism that would become the Wildcat's signature feature. Using only an eraser and an unfolded paperclip, he showed how a diagonal hinge could fold the wings parallel to the fuselage, like a bird at rest. The stow-wing system, as it became known, allowed escort carriers to pack 40% more fighters in their hangars. This innovation alone changed the mathematics of Pacific naval warfare. The production infrastructure supporting the Wildcat dwarfed anything Japan could match. By 1942, the Grumman factory on Long Island employed 7,000 workers across 2 shifts. When demand exceeded Grumman's capacity, the United States Navy contracted General Motors to produce Wildcats under license. General Motors designated these aircraft FM-1 and applied automotive mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. By late 1942, combined production exceeded 15 aircraft per day. Japan's entire monthly fighter production barely reached 150 aircraft across all types. More importantly, American replacement parts flowed in endless supply. A Wildcat damaged in combat could be repaired at forward bases using standardized components shipped from stateside depots. Japanese maintenance crews resorted to cannibalizing crashed aircraft for parts, hand-fabricating replacements, making do with whatever materials they could scavenge. By mid-1943, Japanese aircraft in frontline service averaged one-third of them grounded, awaiting parts or repairs. American squadrons maintained 90% operational readiness. The Wildcat's fuselage was built around a principle that would have horrified Japanese designers: redundancy and survivability. Behind the pilot sat a case-hardened steel plate measuring 8 millimeters thick. It could stop 50 caliber bullets. The front windscreen panel incorporated laminated glass that could absorb 30 caliber rounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks, introduced in 1941 production models, consisted of 2 layers of rubberized canvas, sandwiching a viscous compound. When punctured, this material would swell and plug small holes before significant fuel leaked. Compare this to the Zero's fuel system: 140 gallons distributed between a small fuselage tank and one in each wing. The tanks were nothing more than sealed aluminum boxes, vented to prevent pressure buildup. As fuel burned, highly explosive vapors accumulated. Any tracer or incendiary round could ignite those fumes. Japanese engineers knew this. They considered it an acceptable trade-off for reduced weight. The Wildcat carried 166 gallons in a single fuselage tank, all stored in that self-sealing bladder. As fuel burned, the bladder collapsed, pushing fumes out through vents. The explosion risk approached zero. This single design difference would determine the outcome of hundreds of dogfights. Grumman's obsession with survivability extended throughout the aircraft. The main landing gear was extraordinarily robust, designed to withstand carrier landings that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The entire airframe was over-engineered by Japanese standards, built to absorb punishment and keep flying. Pilots who limped home with one wing shredded, engine smoking, tail surfaces shot away, told and retold their survival stories. The Wildcat became legendary, not for what it did, but for what it survived. The armament reflected American design philosophy. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Each gun carried 240 rounds. Rate of fire, approximately 750 rounds per minute. This gave the pilot roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire. The weight of lead projected by all 6 guns firing simultaneously exceeded the combined firepower of the Zero's cannon and machine guns. Japanese pilots had to manage 2 very different trajectories. The 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannon followed separate flight paths, requiring constant sight adjustment. The Wildcat's 650s all fired on nearly identical trajectories, simplifying deflection shooting. An American pilot who could estimate lead correctly could put all 6 gun streams onto a single point. The resulting impact was devastating. The Wildcat's Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine featured a pressure injection carburetor that operated in any attitude. Upside down, -G, inverted loops, the fuel flowed consistently. The Zero's traditional 2-barrel float carburetor starved for fuel during -G maneuvers or inverted flight. Push the nose down hard or roll inverted, and the Nakajima Sake engine would cough, sputter, die. This single limitation made split-S maneuvers impossible for Zero pilots. Furthermore, the R1830 incorporated a 2-stage supercharger, providing superior performance above 18,000 feet. The Zero's single-stage supercharger gave excellent performance at medium altitudes but dropped off dramatically higher up. Above 20,000 feet, the Wildcat held every advantage. The implications of this wouldn't become clear until American radar controllers learned to vector fighters to altitude before Japanese strikes arrived. The most crucial difference appeared in the controls themselves. Above 280 miles per hour, The Zero's large control surfaces became a liability. Aerodynamic forces made the stick increasingly heavy. By 300 miles per hour, rolling the aircraft required serious muscle. Above 350 miles per hour, the controls locked almost solid. A Zero pilot, in a high-speed dive, effectively flew a straight line until he reduced speed. The Wildcat incorporated servo tabs on all control surfaces, small secondary surfaces that moved opposite to the main control surface, reducing stick forces. A Wildcat pilot could dive to terminal velocity and still maneuver aggressively. This meant an American who entered a fight from altitude could dive, fire a burst, then continue diving away before the Zero could respond. The Japanese called these attacks boom and zoom tactics. They hated them because they couldn't counter them. At the Battle of Coral Sea, May 4th through 8th, 1942, these design differences began manifesting in kill statistics. United States Navy Wildcats shot down 14 A6M Zeros while losing 10 of their own. Not the overwhelming Japanese victory that previous months had produced. Something had changed. Ensign William Leonard, flying from USS Lexington, reported his first encounter with a Zero on May 8th. The Japanese fighter outturned him easily, getting on his tail within seconds. Leonard felt cannon shells walking up his fuselage, heard the impacts, felt his aircraft shudder. His training took over. Full power, push forward on the stick, dive. The Zero followed. At 320 miles per hour, Leonard hauled back on his controls and pulled into a climbing turn. The Wildcat responded instantly. The Zero pilot, controls locked solid by speed, flew straight past and couldn't follow. Leonard got behind him, fired a 2-second burst, watched the Zero explode. He landed back on Lexington with 17 holes in his aircraft, engine still running smooth. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey, also from Lexington, described shooting down 2 Zeros on the same day. In both cases, his 650 caliber machine guns struck the enemy fighters in the fuselage. In both cases, the Zeros erupted in flames instantly. He saw the first pilot bail out, watched his parachute burn as the aircraft exploded. The second pilot never got out. Ramsey's Wildcat took hits from a third Zero, 14 holes clustered around the tail section. He flew it back to the carrier, landed normally, and was flying again the next day. The pattern repeated across multiple engagements that May. Zeros would damage Wildcats. Wildcats would return to their carriers. Zeros would be hit once and disintegrate. The survivability differential was becoming undeniable. Intelligence officers aboard USS Yorktown compiled a report after Coral Sea analyzing combat losses. Of the 10 Wildcats shot down, 7 pilots were rescued. 3 died in crashes, but 4 survived direct hits that would have killed Zero pilots instantly, then ditched successfully and were picked up by destroyers. Of the 14 Zeros destroyed, intelligence estimated that at least 12 pilots died. The difference: American pilots could survive being shot down. Japanese pilots could not. This wasn't just about aircraft survivability. It was about pilot survivability, pilot recovery, pilot retention. Every American who made it home could teach the next pilot what he had learned. Every Japanese pilot who died took his knowledge with him. Lieutenant Commander John Thach had spent months analyzing Zero capabilities. Every report from China, every intelligence summary from early Pacific battles told the same story. The Zero outturned everything. Trying to dogfight a Zero in a traditional turning battle was suicide. But Thach noticed something in the reports. Zero pilots always tried to get behind their target. They were trained for tail attacks, positioned by superior maneuverability, executed with their light controls. What if you denied them that advantage? Thach developed a defensive tactic he called the beam defense maneuver. 2 fighters flew parallel courses about 200 feet apart. When an enemy attacked one fighter, both immediately turned toward each other. The Zero, committed to following the first fighter, would pass in front of the second fighter's guns. If the Zero tried to follow the second fighter instead, the first fighter could shoot it. Either way, the Zero pilot faced a head-on gun pass from 6 50-caliber machine guns. The geometry was elegant. A Zero pilot behind one Wildcat had, at most, a deflection angle of about 15 degrees, a difficult but manageable shot. When both Wildcats turned toward each other, that Zero suddenly faced a 90-degree deflection shot at the original target, while presenting a near-zero deflection shot to the other Wildcat. Japanese pilots trained for tail attacks found themselves exposed to head-on attacks, their worst nightmare given their lack of armor. The tactic required perfect coordination and absolute trust between wingmen. It also required radio discipline, situational awareness, and the ability to keep sight of both your wingman and the enemy while maneuvering violently. These skills didn't exist in the United States Navy in December 1941. By May 1942, enough pilots had survived enough combat to make Thatch's Weave possible. Thach tested the Weave during the Coral Sea battle with mixed results. The concept worked, but executing it under fire while maintaining formation cohesion proved difficult. He refined the procedures, drilling his pilots repeatedly. By June, his section could execute the Weave while barely looking at each other, pure muscle memory, and practiced coordination. June 4th, 1942. 07, 15 hours. The same morning, Shindo began his attack on the Wildcats over Midway. Jimmy Thatch led 6 F4F-4s against a Japanese strike force. 15 to 20 Zeros from Kido Butai's Combat Air Patrol swarmed his formation. Thach immediately implemented his Weave. For 25 minutes, 3 Wildcats under constant attack wove back and forth, each protecting the other's tail, each taking snap shots at Zeros attempting head-on passes. The Japanese pilots, veterans of 100 dogfights, found themselves unable to establish firing positions. Every time a Zero committed to a tail attack, another Wildcat's guns appeared in front of it. The Japanese broke off, regrouped, attacked again. Same result. Thatch's wingman, Ensign Edward Dibb, described the engagement in his after-action report. The Zeros came at us from every direction. I counted at least 15, probably more. Commander Thach called the Weave, and we executed it exactly as practiced. Every time a Zero got behind me, I turned toward the skipper, and he shot it. Every time one got behind him, he turned toward me, and I shot it. It sounds simple. It wasn't. You're pulling 6 Gs. You're tracking your wingman, tracking the enemy, watching your airspeed, your altitude, your ammunition. But it worked. God, it worked. The engagement left Thatch's section with 3 Zeros confirmed destroyed, possibly 2 more damaged. All 3 Wildcats made it back to Yorktown. Dibb's aircraft had taken multiple 7.7mm hits in the wing and tail. Thatch's aircraft had cannon damage in the empennage. Both aircraft were repaired overnight and flew again the next day. Zero pilots reported the engagement with something approaching disbelief. Flight Petty Officer Masao Iizuka, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, filed a combat report, noting that the American fighters refused to engage in turning combat and instead used a crossing maneuver that prevented proper attack positioning. 3 of our aircraft were lost attempting to break up this formation. This tactic must be countered, but there was no counter. The Weave exploited the Zero's fundamental limitation. It could only fight one way. Strip away the Zero's ability to get behind its target, and you stripped away its advantage. The Wildcat, with its superior dive performance and rugged construction, could survive long enough to execute the Weave. The Zero, fragile and unarmored, could not survive the head-on passes the Weave created. This was not how it was supposed to work. At Midway, overall statistics still favored the Japanese. The kill ratio remained close to 1-to-1, but the trend was shifting. American pilots were learning. More importantly, They were surviving long enough to teach others. By August 7th, 1942, when Marines landed on Guadalcanal, United States Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadrons had internalized Thatch's lessons. The Weave had evolved into the Finger Four formation, 2 elements of 2 aircraft each, positioned like fingertips on an outstretched hand. Each pilot covered his wingman, each element covered the other element. The formation could defend, attack, reform, all while maintaining mutual support. Japanese pilots still flew the 3-plane Shotai. It remained an offensive formation optimized for individual aerobatic combat. When dogfights devolved into 1 versus 1 engagements, the Shotai structure collapsed. The Finger Four remained coherent, even in swirling furballs, because its defensive nature allowed quick reformation. Between August 7th and November 15th, 1942, Wildcats shot down 72 Zeros while losing 70 of their own, nearly even. But in carrier versus carrier battles during that same period, 43 Zeros went down at a cost of 31 Wildcats. The ratio was moving. The fighting over Guadalcanal's Henderson Field became a laboratory for American tactical development. Marine Fighter Squadron 224, known as the Wildcats, flew the F4F-4 from the coral strip hacked out of jungle. They faced daily raids from Rabaul, 250 miles northwest, where Japanese bombers and fighters staged through in 100-plane formations. August 24th, 1942, 09:30 hours, Henderson Field. First Lieutenant Marion Carl spotted a formation of 18 Japanese bombers, escorted by 12 Zeros approaching from the northwest. Carl had 4 Wildcats. He positioned his section 6,000 feet above the Japanese formation, waiting until the enemy was committed to their bombing run, then dove. Carl's attack plan exploited everything the Americans had learned. Attack from altitude, use speed, make 1 firing pass, extend away, don't dogfight, don't try to outturn the Zero. Use the Wildcat's strengths. Carl dove through the Zero screen before they could react, fired a 4-second burst into a bomber, watched it explode, then continued diving away. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Ken Frazier, did the same. 2 bombers destroyed, 2 Wildcats safely away before the Zeros could engage. But Zero pilots adapted. They began positioning combat air patrol elements higher, matching the American altitude advantage. They began refusing to chase diving Wildcats, holding position to protect the bombers. The tactical arms race continued. August 30th, 1942. Henderson Field came under attack by 27 bombers, with 18 Zero escorts. Marine Captain Marion Carl, the same pilot from 6 days earlier, led 8 Wildcats into the formation. This time, Zeros were waiting at altitude. A massive dogfight erupted at 20,000 feet. Carl's after-action report described the engagement. We hit them from above as planned, but this time the Zeros were ready. 6 of them came down on us immediately. I called the Weave. My section executed it perfectly. We shot down 2 Zeros in the first 30 seconds, but there were too many of them. They split our formation, got behind Lieutenant Pond. His aircraft took multiple hits, caught fire. He bailed out. We saw his chute. 3 more Zeros came at my section. We wove back and forth for about 10 minutes. Got another one. Lost visual on Lieutenant Smith's element. Ammunition ran low. Extended north, RTB. Landed with less than 40 rounds remaining. The Marines shot down 7 Zeros and 3 bombers that day. They lost 3 Wildcats, 2 pilots rescued. The kill ratio was improving, but at terrible cost. Henderson Field was operating with fewer than 20 serviceable fighters. Reinforcements arrived sporadically. Parts shortages meant cannibalization. Fuel supplies ran critically low, and the Japanese kept coming. September 8th, 1942, 13:45 hours. A massive raid approached Henderson Field. Intelligence estimated 40 bombers with 30 fighter escorts. Marine Fighter Squadron 223 scrambled every available aircraft, 19 Wildcats total. They intercepted the Japanese formation 20 miles northwest of the field. Major John Smith, commanding 223, split his force. One division would attack the bombers from above, the other would engage the Zero escort. It was a calculated risk. Engaging Zeros directly violated the boom and zoom doctrine. But if the bombers got through, Henderson Field would be destroyed. The Bomber Attack Division, led by Captain Carl, dove through the formation exactly as planned. They shot down 4 bombers in the first pass, but the 2nd Division, engaging the Zeros, took heavy losses. The Japanese fighters outturned the Wildcats easily in horizontal combat. 3 F4Fs went down in the first 2 minutes, but something unexpected happened. As the battle continued, American pilots began noticing Zero pilots hesitating. A Wildcat would take damage, smoke streaming from the engine, and instead of pressing the attack, the Zero pilot would break off. They were seeing Wildcats absorb damage and keep flying too often. The psychological impact was accumulating. Lieutenant Roger Haberman, flying that day, described shooting at a Zero at close range. I got a good, solid deflection shot, saw strikes all over his fuselage. He came apart, just disintegrated, pieces flying everywhere. I had seen Wildcats take worse damage and make it home. This Zero just vaporized. That's when I really understood the difference between our aircraft and theirs. The September 8th engagement ended with 12 Japanese bombers destroyed, 8 Zeros shot down at a cost of 5 Wildcats. 3 American pilots were killed, 2 rescued. The ratio was shifting. October 13th, 1942. Henderson Field. Captain Joe Foss, United States Marine Corps, scored his first kill during his first combat mission. His F4F-4 was also severely damaged by 3 Zeros that caught him alone. He nursed his aircraft back to Henderson Field with a dead engine, no flaps, landing at full speed on one of the worst airstrips in the Pacific. He walked away. Foss's first combat mission set the pattern for his entire combat tour. Aggressive attack, exploit Wildcat survivability, bring the aircraft home no matter what. Over the next 3 months, he would be shot down 6 times. He would survive every bailout, every ditching, every crash landing. The Wildcat would break. Foss would not. October 23rd, 1942. 10:15 hours. Foss led his division against a mixed formation of bombers and Zeros. He positioned his section 5,000 feet above the Japanese, waited for the perfect moment, then dove. His first burst hit a bomber's port engine, which erupted in flames. He continued through the formation, extended away, climbed back up, repositioned, attacked again. On his second pass, 3 Zeros intercepted him. They got behind his aircraft, poured cannon fire into his tail section. Foss felt the impacts, saw his aileron controls go sluggish. He pushed the stick forward, dove away at full power. The Zeros followed. At 340 miles per hour, their controls locked. Foss's servo tabs kept working. He pulled up, got behind 1 Zero, fired a 2-second burst, watched it explode. His Wildcat had 17 holes in the fuselage. The tail surfaces were shredded. 1 aileron was barely attached. He landed it. The aircraft was a write-off. He was flying again the next day in a different F4F. November 7th, 1942. Same story. Multiple hits, ditching at sea, rescued, back in combat. The mathematics of survival were simple. The Wildcat could be damaged and still fly. The Zero could not. The Wildcat pilot could survive bailouts and crashes. The Zero pilot usually could not. Over time, this differential compounded. American pilot experience levels rose. Japanese pilot experience levels fell. By November, radar operators on Guadalcanal had learned to provide excellent early warning. Wildcats could launch, climb to altitude, position themselves advantageously before Japanese formations arrived. The tables were turning completely. Zero pilots, arriving at medium altitude after a long flight from Rabaul, found themselves looking up at Wildcats with altitude and energy advantage. The hunters had become hunted. November 12, 1942, 0:12:30 hours. A Japanese strike of 30 bombers and 20 Zeros approached Henderson Field. Marine radar detected them 60 miles out. Major Joe Foss scrambled with 12 Wildcats, climbed to 25,000 feet, positioned northwest of the expected attack route. The Japanese formation passed below them at 18,000 feet. Foss led his squadron down in a near-vertical dive. 12 Wildcats, 6 guns each, 72 streams of 50 caliber fire, converging on the Japanese bomber formation. 7 bombers disintegrated in the first 10 seconds. The Zeros, caught below and behind, couldn't climb fast enough to intercept. By the time they reached attack position, the Wildcats had already pulled out of their dives and were extending away at 400 miles per hour. The Zeros tried to pursue. At that speed, their controls were essentially locked. The Wildcats climbed back to altitude, repositioned, attacked again. Same result. 3 more bombers destroyed, 1 Zero that tried to follow the dive and couldn't pull out in time. The remaining Japanese aircraft turned back without dropping a single bomb. Foss's squadron lost 0 aircraft. This was the new mathematics: superior tactics, superior positioning, superior aircraft survivability, superior pilot training. The kill ratio that had been even at Coral Sea was now approaching 5-1 in favor of the Americans. October 13, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Captain Joe Foss, United States Marine Corps, scored his first kill during his first combat mission. His F4F-4 was also severely damaged by 3 Zeros that caught him alone. He nursed his aircraft back to Henderson Field with a dead engine, no flaps, landing at full speed on one of the worst airstrips in the Pacific. He walked away. November 7th, 1942. Same location. Foss's Wildcat took multiple hits from Zero cannon fire. His engine seized. He ditched at sea, was rescued, returned to combat within a week. The aircraft was a total loss. The pilot was not. This pattern repeated itself hundreds of times across the Pacific. Zeros and Wildcats would clash. Both sides would score hits. The Zero would explode in flames or disintegrate. The Wildcat would limp home smoking, half its tail gone, oil streaming from its engine, but it would make it home. Japanese pilots began reporting a disturbing pattern. They would get behind a Wildcat, pour cannon fire into it, see strikes walking across the fuselage, and the American would continue flying. The Wildcat would dive away, engine still running, pilot still alive. Meanwhile, a single burst of 50 caliber fire into a Zero could kill the pilot, ignite the fuel tanks, or sever control cables. The survivability differential was becoming impossible to ignore. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace with 64 kills, described his first encounter with a Wildcat's durability in his post-war memoir. Over Guadalcanal, he positioned perfectly behind an F4F, fired a long burst of 20mm cannon shells, saw hits all over the aircraft, and watched it simply continue flying straight and level before diving away into clouds. His cannon had run dry. He had fired every round. The Wildcat had absorbed it all and escaped. By December 1942, American radar installations on Guadalcanal were vectoring Wildcat fighters to altitude before Japanese strikes arrived. This exploited the F4F's superior high-altitude performance. Japanese formations, optimized for medium-altitude operations, suddenly found themselves attacked from above by diving Wildcats. The Americans would make one high-speed pass, guns blazing, then continue diving away. Zero pilots would attempt pursuit, only to find their controls stiffening as speed increased. By the time they could maneuver effectively, the Americans were gone. The mathematics of aerial combat were inverting. Early war, Japanese pilots could choose when to fight. Superior speed and maneuverability meant they controlled engagement and disengagement. Now, American pilots were choosing when to fight. Superior dive performance and high-altitude capability meant they attacked from positions of advantage, then left before the Japanese could respond. The hunter was becoming hunted. January 25, 1943, 08:30 hours, Henderson Field. Captain Joe Foss, now commanding a Marine fighter squadron, spotted a formation of 100 Japanese bombers and escorts approaching Guadalcanal. Foss had 12 Wildcats. The Japanese had him outnumbered 8-1. He attacked anyway. Foss led his squadron into the overcast, using clouds as concealment. The Wildcats would burst out of clouds, make a single high-speed firing pass, then disappear back into the weather before the Zero escorts could react. The Japanese bomber formation, unable to determine how many fighters were attacking, assumed they faced a much larger force. They broke off without dropping a single bomb. Foss's flying circus shot down 4 Zeros in the engagement. This was the tactic that terrified Japanese commanders. Small numbers of American fighters, properly positioned, using their aircraft's strengths, could defeat much larger formations. The Zero's advantages in turning combat became irrelevant if the Americans refused to turn. The superior Japanese pilot training became meaningless if those pilots couldn't establish firing positions. By February 3, 1943, when organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal ceased, United States Navy and Marine Corps aviators flying F4F Wildcats had shot down 5.9 Japanese aircraft for every Wildcat lost. The kill ratio had gone from parity to 6-1 in 6 months, but the transformation wasn't just tactical, it was industrial. While Japanese factories struggled to replace lost aircraft and train new pilots, American production lines were hitting full stride. The Grumman plant on Long Island was producing Wildcats at an increasing rate. General Motors, contracted to build F4Fs under license, designated them FM-1 and added its massive manufacturing capacity. By mid-1943, Wildcats were rolling off assembly lines faster than the Japanese could destroy them. Training told a similar story. The United States Navy pulled combat veterans from frontline squadrons and rotated them back to training commands. Joe Foss taught gunnery to new pilots. Jimmy Thatch taught his weave to entire squadrons. Lessons learned in blood over the Pacific were institutionalized, systematized, spread throughout the force. Every new pilot received the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of combats before ever seeing an enemy fighter. Japanese pilot training deteriorated throughout 1943. American submarines savaged Japanese tanker traffic, reducing fuel available for flight schools. Raw materials for aircraft construction dwindled. Training programs shortened from months to weeks. Rather than rotating combat veterans back to training commands, the Imperial Japanese Navy kept them on the front lines until they died. The experience differential reversed completely. By mid-1943, American replacement pilots often had more flight time than their Japanese opponents. The cumulative effect appeared in kill ratios. Coral Sea, roughly even. Midway, slightly favoring Americans. Guadalcanal, by February, 5.9-1. By late 1943, the ratio reached 6.9-1. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Wildcat lost. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo survived Midway. He survived Guadalcanal. In 1943, he was transferred to a training command in Japan, one of the few experienced pilots pulled back from combat. He spent 6 months teaching new pilots how to fly the Zero. Most had less than 200 hours total flight time. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. They were teenagers, barely old enough to shave, rushed through truncated training programs because the Empire needed pilots immediately. Shindo tried to teach them everything he knew. Superior maneuverability meant nothing if you couldn't get behind the enemy. aggressive spirit couldn't defeat 650 caliber machine guns. The Zero's light weight made it fragile. One hit could be fatal. They needed to attack from altitude, make one pass, disengage. They needed to fight, like the Americans now fought. The new pilots looked at him with confusion. This wasn't what the Imperial Japanese Navy taught. Warriors attacked. Warriors dominated through fighting spirit and superior skill. Defensive flying, hit-and-run tactics, these were cowards' techniques. Shindo realized his students would die. They would die the same way hundreds of experienced pilots had died. They would try to dogfight Wildcats, thinking superior maneuverability would save them. They would discover that maneuverability didn't matter when 50 caliber bullets were ripping through their unarmored cockpit. They would learn that fighting spirit couldn't seal punctured fuel tanks or restart dead engines. They would die before they learned anything. Documents captured after the war revealed the full scope of Japanese losses. Intelligence reports from late 1942 showed Japanese commanders beginning to understand what they faced. One report, dated November 19, 1942, acknowledged that American fighters were increasingly difficult to destroy, and that tactics relying on maneuverability no longer produced decisive results. Another, from January 1943, admitted that pilot losses cannot be sustained at current rates and recommended fundamental reassessment of fighter doctrine. Nothing changed. The doctrine remained: aggressive attack, superior aerobatics, fighting spirit. The Zero remained in production, largely unmodified. Attempts to add armor or self-sealing fuel tanks failed because the additional weight destroyed the aircraft's performance. The Zero was locked into its design philosophy, optimized for a type of combat that no longer existed. Post-war testimony from Japanese pilots revealed the psychological impact. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's highest-scoring ace with over 80 kills, told American interrogators in 1946 that by mid-1943, Zero pilots no longer looked forward to encountering Wildcats. The Americans had learned to use their advantages, while Japanese pilots continued tactics that no longer worked. He described watching inexperienced pilots dive after Wildcats, only to find their controls locked solid at high speed. The Americans would simply extend away, Zero pilots unable to follow, unable to shoot, unable to do anything but watch their targets escape. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Sadamu, operations officer for the Japanese Navy's main fighter wing, admitted in post-war interviews that by early 1944, the appearance of even small numbers of Wildcats would cause entire Japanese formations to break off attacks. The Americans had become too difficult to kill, he said. Our pilots knew that engaging them would likely result in our own deaths, regardless of the tactical situation. This was a complete reversal from 1941. The final statistics told the story the Japanese military had tried to hide. Total World War II sorties, flown by F4F Wildcats, 15,553. Enemy aircraft destroyed, 1,327. Wildcats lost to enemy action, 178. Final kill ratio, 6.9 to 1. These numbers didn't include the hundreds of Wildcats that made it home after battle damage that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. They didn't count the pilots who walked away from crashes that killed Zero pilots. They didn't measure the cumulative effect of American training programs that got better as the war progressed, while Japanese training deteriorated. Joe Foss ended the war with 26 victories, all in F4F Wildcats. He received the Medal of Honor. He became governor of South Dakota. He lived to age 87. In interviews late in life, he always spoke fondly of the Wildcat. It was like a brother to me, he said. It was tough, and I would be able to destroy the enemy with it. I couldn't blame it for the speed it didn't have, but I felt at home. Jimmy Thatch survived the war, rose to vice admiral, revolutionized carrier aviation tactics. The Thatch Weave is still taught to fighter pilots today. In 1946, he told a Navy Board of Inquiry, investigating fighter aircraft performance, that the Wildcat saved the Pacific War. Without its survivability, without its ability to absorb damage and bring pilots home, the United States Navy would have run out of experienced aviators by mid-1942. The Japanese shot down plenty of our aircraft, Thach testified, but they didn't kill enough of our pilots. That made all the difference. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo survived the war. He was flying a Zero on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. In 1953, at a gathering of former Japanese naval aviators in Tokyo, Shindo gave a speech about the lessons of the Pacific War. The portion dealing with the Wildcat was stark. "We mocked them," he said. "We called them chickens. We thought their slow speed and heavy weight made them inferior. We were wrong. They built an aircraft that could be shot but not killed. They built an aircraft that brought their pilots home. They developed tactics that negated our advantages. They trained their pilots better as the war progressed while our training collapsed. By the end, we were no longer hunting them. They were hunting us." He paused, looking at the younger officers in the audience, men who had been children during the war. The Americans understood something we did not. The best fighter is not the fastest or the most maneuverable. The best fighter is the one that wins. The Wildcat won. June 4th, 1942, 06:45 hours, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo dove toward the climbing Wildcats with absolute confidence. He was about to learn his first lesson. Within months, that lesson would become a survival manual. Within a year, it would become a eulogy for an entire generation of Japanese pilots who learned too late that mockery is a luxury belonging only to victors.